In the heart of a bustling downtown neighborhood, the Common Cup had long been a haven for locals. Its eclectic interior, wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and walls adorned with community art invited patrons to linger over steaming cups of coffee. The cafe was known for more than its brews. It was a place where everyone, regardless of background, could feel welcome. Emily, one of the cafe's baristas, had worked there for 3 years. At 25, she took pride in her role, not just as a coffee maker, but as someone who helped create a sense of a community. She believed fiercely in the Common Cup's motto, painted in bold script above the counter, where everyone belongs. It was a busy morning, and the cafe buzzed with energy. The line stretched to the door as Emily moved with practiced efficiency, her hands expertly pouring lattes and handing out pastries. The smell of coffee and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversation. Then the doorbell jingled. Emily glanced up out of habit, her usual welcoming smile faltering slightly. A man had walked in, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a red baseball cap. It wasn't just the cap's color that caught her eye, but the unmistakable emblem embroidered on it. It was a MAGA hat. The cafe seemed to hold its collective breath. Conversations quieted. A few heads turned and an unspoken tension rippled through the room. The man, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, walked to the counter with an easy confidence. He wore a leather jacket and dark jeans, his demeanor calm and assured. "Morning," he said, his voice warm. "Black coffee, please." Emily froze for a split second before regaining her composure. Her heart raced as she tried to focus on the task at hand, but her mind was flooded with thoughts about the man in front of her. The hat wasn't just a piece of apparel, it was a statement, a symbol of a political movement she associated with division and exclusion. And while she prided herself on treating every customer equally, this felt different, personal. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. I can't serve you." The cafe fell silent. Conversation stopped entirely as patrons turned their attention to the counter. The man's easy smile faded, replaced by a look of surprise. "Excuse me?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Emily swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter. "It's the hat," she said, her voice firmer now. "It doesn't align with what this cafe stands for." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but tinged with curiosity. He glanced around the room, noting the eyes on him. When he turned back to Emily, his voice was steady but measured. "And what does this cafe stand for exactly?" Emily hesitated, glancing at the motto above the counter, "Where everyone belongs." The irony of the moment wasn't lost on her, but she stood her ground. "It stands for inclusivity," she said, "for making people feel safe and welcome. That hat, it doesn't make people feel that way." The man let out a slow breath, nodding slightly as if to acknowledge her reasoning. "I see," he said softly. For a moment he said nothing more, his thoughtful gaze fixed on her. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it gently on the counter. Emily's eyes darted to the card, her breath catching as she read the bold print. James Thornton, founder and CEO, Thornton Coffee Company. Her stomach dropped. James met her gaze, his expression calm but firm. "I started this cafe," he said quietly. "I built it from the ground up because I wanted to create a space where people could come together, where everyone belongs, just like your sign says." Emily's face burned with embarrassment as the weight of his words sank in. She had just refused service to the man who owned the Common Cup. The silence in the cafe grew heavier, whispers rippling among the patrons as they began to realize who James was. "I didn't know," Emily stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." James nodded once, his expression softening. "It's okay," he said. "You were standing up for what you believe in. I respect that. But this cafe is meant to be more than just a place for coffee. It's supposed to be a place for connection, for conversation. And that only works if we're willing to sit down and listen to each other." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat, her earlier certainty giving way to doubt. She thought about the man standing in front of her, his calm demeanor, his willingness to engage despite her refusal. Slowly, she nodded. "You're right," she said softly. "I didn't give you a chance." James offered her a faint smile. "It's not too late?" Emily hesitated, still holding the business card in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of her actions hanging heavy over her. She glanced around, catching glimpses of curious gazes and murmured whispers from the patrons. Can I make you that coffee now?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. James studied her for a moment, his expression softening further. "I'd like that," he said simply. Emily nodded and turned back to the counter, her movements deliberate as she prepared the black coffee. Her thoughts raced, replaying everything that had just happened. She had always prided herself on being someone who stood up for her values, but now she wasn't so sure. Had she been standing up for inclusivity, or had she let her assumptions get in the way of truly understanding someone? As she placed the cup on the counter in front of James, she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Here you go," she said, "and thank you for not just walking out." James gave her a small nod as he picked up the cup. "Thanks for making it." He turned toward the tables but paused, glancing back at her. "Do you mind if I sit for a while? Maybe we can talk later." Emily blinked, caught off guard by his offer. Yeah, sure." James smiled faintly and made his way to a small table near the window. He set his cup down, pulled out his notebook, and began jotting something down, his demeanor calm and unbothered. Emily watched him for a moment, feeling a strange mix of relief and curiosity. As the morning rush died down, the cafe returned to its usual rhythm. The hum of conversation filled the air once more, and Emily found herself with a bit of breathing room. She wiped down the counter, her eyes occasionally drifting toward James, who remained engrossed in his notebook. "Is he really the owner?" Sarah, her co-worker, whispered as she returned from the kitchen with a tray of clean mugs. "Yeah?" Emily replied, her voice low. "I had no idea." Sarah glanced toward James, her brow furrowing slightly. "You handled that better than I would have. I probably would have run out the back door." Emily managed a small laugh. "I wanted to, but he's not what I expected." Sarah nodded thoughtfully before heading off to clear a nearby table. Emily, left alone with her thoughts, took a deep breath. She couldn't shake the feeling that she owed James more than just a coffee. She owed him a conversation. It wasn't until the early afternoon, when the cafe was quieter, that Emily finally mustered the courage to approach him. She carried a fresh cup of coffee to his table, setting it down gently. "On the house," she said, trying to sound casual. James looked up, his eyes warm with surprise. "Thanks. You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," she said quickly, "and I wanted to say I'm sorry. Again. For earlier." James leaned back slightly, his notebook now closed. "You've already apologized." "I know," Emily said, her cheeks flushing, "but I think I owe you more than that. I think I owe you a real conversation." James studied her for a moment, then gestured to the chair across from him. "Have a seat." Emily hesitated but finally sat down, feeling uncharacteristically nervous. "I guess I don't know, that hat. It's hard for me to separate it from everything I've seen and heard, from everything it represents to me." James nodded, his expression understanding. "And what does it represent to you?" Emily paused, gathering her thoughts. "Division," she said finally. "Fear, a kind of us versus them mentality that I've always hated. And honestly, it reminds me of policies and rhetoric that have hurt people I care about." James listened intently, his gaze never leaving hers. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "I get that," he said. "I really do. And I won't pretend that every person who wears this hat has good intentions. But for me, it represents something different." "What does it represent to you?" Emily asked, her voice quieter now. James took a deep breath, glancing briefly at the red cap on the table beside him. "To me, it's a reminder of the values I believe in. Freedom, responsibility, the idea that anyone can succeed if they work hard enough. It's about the America I grew up believing in. I know not everyone sees it that way, but that's what it means to me." Emily frowned slightly, mulling over his words. "Do you ever think about what it means to the people who don't see it that way? People who feel excluded by it?" "All the time," James admitted, "and I know that for some people, seeing me wear it might feel like a slap in the face. But I also think that if we never talk about why we feel the way we do, if we never try to understand each other, we're just going to keep getting more divided. Emily nodded slowly, her thoughts swirling. I guess I've never really had a conversation like this before, not with someone on the other side. James smiled faintly. Neither had I until I started this cafe. It's taught me a lot, like how much harder it is to hate someone when you take the time to know them. Emily glanced toward the counter where Sarah was handling the few remaining customers. The cafe had quieted considerably, the afternoon lull settling in. For the first time all day, Emily felt herself relax. Do you think it works? She asked suddenly. Talking, I mean. Do you think it actually makes a difference? James tilted his head slightly, considering her question. I think it can, he said. Not every time and not with everyone. But even one meaningful conversation can create a ripple. And sometimes that's enough. Emily leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the mural on the far wall. It depicted clasped hands in a rainbow of colors, a visual representation of the cafe's motto. For the first time, she felt like she truly understood what it meant. Emily traced the outline of the mural with her eyes, her mind spinning with thoughts she hadn't expected to confront today. The words "where everyone belongs" suddenly carried a weight she hadn't considered before. She glanced back at James, who was watching her with a quiet patience. I guess I've always thought of this place as more of a refuge, she admitted. Somewhere people like me can escape from all the stuff out there that feels overwhelming. That's fair, James said, his voice steady. But maybe it can be both, a refuge and a bridge. A place where people feel safe enough to connect, even when it's hard. Emily nodded slowly, her hands fiddling with the edge of her apron. It's just hard to get past everything that hat brings up for me. It feels like it's tied to so much hurt. James looked down at the red cap resting on the table. For a moment, he didn't say anything, his fingers lightly tapping against the edge of his notebook. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. I get that, he said, and I don't expect everyone to be okay with it. But I also think it's important to stand by what you believe, even if it makes people uncomfortable, as long as you're willing to listen to why they feel the way they do. Emily tilted her head, intrigued. Do you ever get tired of explaining yourself? James chuckled, a low, warm sound. All the time, he admitted. But I think it's worth it. If even one person walks away understanding me a little better, it's a win. Emily thought about that for a moment, then asked, Have you always been like this, so patient? James smiled faintly. Not always. I used to get defensive, try to argue my way through every disagreement. But I learned that people don't respond to arguments, they respond to understanding. It's not about winning, it's about connecting. The sincerity in his voice made Emily's chest ache. She thought about all the debates she'd had in the past, all the times she had walked away feeling more frustrated than fulfilled. She realized now that she had been so focused on being right that she had missed the chance to really connect with people. So, what made you start this place? She asked, leaning forward slightly. Why a cafe? James's gaze drifted to the mural. Because food and coffee bring people together, he said. They create moments of connection. I figured if I could use that to build something bigger, a space where people feel seen and heard, it might make a difference. Emily smiled softly. I think it already has. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the cafe's golden light began to shift, casting longer shadows across the floor. The late afternoon lull gave Emily a chance to reflect, and she found herself lingering at James's table longer than she had planned. She realized she didn't want the conversation to end. What's next for you? She asked. With the cafe, I mean. James shrugged lightly. I don't know yet. I try to take it one day at a time, but I'd like to see more places like this. Not just coffee shops, but spaces where people can really connect. Emily tilted her head, considering his words. Do you think that's enough? Creating spaces like this? James's smile turned wistful. It's a start. You can't fix everything at once, but you can make small changes. Sometimes that's all it takes. A small group of customers entered the cafe, breaking the quiet moment. Emily stood, brushing her hands against her apron. "Duty calls," she said with a faint smile. James nodded. "Thanks for sitting down with me." "Thanks for not giving up on me," she said, her voice sincere. James's smile widened. "Never crossed my mind." As Emily returned to the counter, she noticed how the cafe seemed to hum with a different energy. Conversations felt lighter, more open, as if the room itself had absorbed some of the understanding James carried with him. She couldn't help but feel that something had shifted, not just in the cafe, but in her. As the evening wore on, Emily found herself catching glimpses of James between orders. He remained seated at his small table by the window, occasionally jotting something down in his notebook or gazing out at the street. A few customers approached him tentatively, striking up quiet conversations. Emily watched as James listened intently, his calm demeanor drawing them in like a magnet. She couldn't help but marvel at his patience. Here he was, a man who had every reason to be defensive or dismissive after the way he'd been treated, yet he seemed entirely focused on building connections. It was humbling, and if she was honest with herself, a little inspiring. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow across the cafe, Emily decided to take a moment to check in with him. The cafe had quieted significantly, with only a few regulars lingering over their drinks. She poured herself a cup of coffee and walked over to his table. "Mind if I join you again?" she asked, holding up her cup. James looked up and smiled. "Not at all." She slid into the chair across from him, setting her mug down carefully. For a moment they sat in silence, the quiet hum of the cafe filling the space between them. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Emily began, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup, "about how you try to meet people halfway, even when it's uncomfortable." James tilted his head slightly, encouraging her to continue. "I guess I've always thought of it as my job to stand up for what I believe in," she said, "to push back against the things I think are wrong. But today made me realize maybe I've been so focused on pushing back that I've forgotten how to listen." James nodded thoughtfully. "It's a hard balance to strike," he said, "standing up for what you believe in while staying open to other perspectives, but I think it's worth trying." Emily sipped her coffee, her gaze drifting to the mural on the wall. "I always thought I was good at that, at being open, I mean. But seeing how I reacted to you today, it made me realize I still have a lot to learn." James smiled gently. "We all do. The fact that you're willing to reflect on it says a lot." Emily met his eyes, her chest tightening slightly at the sincerity in his expression. "Do you ever feel like it's exhausting?" she asked, "trying to connect with people who don't see the world the way you do?" James chuckled softly. "All the time," he admitted. "But I think about what the alternative would be. Everyone staying in their own corners, never talking, never trying to understand each other. That feels even more exhausting." Emily nodded, her mind swirling with thoughts she hadn't considered before. "You make it sound so simple," she said with a faint smile. James shook his head. "It's not simple. It's messy and it's hard, but it's worth it." The bell above the door jingled, and a group of teenagers walked in, their laughter filling the quiet cafe. Emily glanced at the clock. It was nearly closing time, but she didn't mind. The day had been long, but it felt meaningful in a way she hadn't expected. "I should probably get back to work," she said, standing and picking up her empty cup. James nodded, his smile warm. "Thanks for the conversation," he said. "I mean it." Emily hesitated, then smiled back. "No, thank you, for reminding me what this place is supposed to be about." As she returned to the counter, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in a long time. The cafe had always been her refuge, her safe space. But maybe it could be more than that. Maybe it could be a place where people didn't just belong, but where they grew. As the teenagers placed their orders, Emily moved with a lightness in her step. The conversations she'd had with James throughout the day stayed with her, echoing in her mind. For years, she had seen the common cup as a place of comfort and community, but now she was beginning to see its potential as something greater, a bridge between worlds that so often seemed irreconcilably divided. The teenagers settled at a table near the back, their laughter punctuating the calm hum of the cafe. Emily glanced over at James, who had returned to his notebook, his pen moving steadily across the page. She couldn't help but wonder what he was writing. Plans for the cafe, reflections on the day, or maybe just thoughts about the countless people he must have encountered over the years. Her curiosity got the better of her. During another lull, she walked back to his table, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached. "You're writing a lot over there," she said with a small smile. "Mind if I ask what it's about?" James looked up, his pen pausing mid-stroke. He smiled, closing the notebook with a deliberate motion. "Just some thoughts about today," he said, "and about this place. It always gives me a lot to think about." Emily raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Care to share?" James hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly on the cover of the notebook. "I've been thinking about how places like this, simple places where people come together over something as ordinary as coffee, have the power to shape conversations, to change minds even." Emily tilted her head. Her interest piqued. "You really believe that? That a cafe can change minds?" "I do," James said, "not all at once and not every time. But small moments of connection can ripple outward in ways we don't always see, and if enough people have those moments, it adds up." Emily considered his words, her gaze drifting to the mural on the wall. She thought about the customers who had come through the doors that day, some curious, some skeptical, all carrying their own stories. She thought about Mark, the law student, who had left the cafe visibly changed after his conversation with James. "You've been doing this for a while, haven't you?" she asked. "Having these conversations, trying to connect with people." James nodded. "Ever since I started this cafe, it's not always easy, but it's always worth it." Emily smiled faintly, her respect for him growing. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple," James said, shaking his head. "It's messy and uncomfortable, and sometimes it doesn't work. But when it does—" He trailed off, a thoughtful look in his eyes. "When it does, it reminds me why I started all this in the first place." As the evening wore on, the cafe began to empty out. The teenagers left with their half-finished drinks, leaving behind a scattering of napkins and crumbs. Emily wiped down their table, glancing at the clock. It was almost closing time. James remained at his spot by the window, his notebook now tucked away. He seemed content to simply sit and watch the world outside. Emily found herself drawn to his quiet presence, the way he seemed at peace even after a day filled with tension and difficult conversations. When the last customer left, Emily locked the door and flipped the sign to closed. She walked over to James's table, her hands in her pockets. "You're welcome to stay while I clean up," she said, "if you're not in a rush." James looked up, his smile warm. "Thanks, I'll stick around for a bit." As Emily moved around the cafe, stacking chairs and wiping down surfaces, she found herself talking to James in between tasks. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from the challenges of running a business to the ways people could find common ground in an increasingly divided world. "Do you ever feel like it's too much?" Emily asked as she wiped down the counter. "Like the world's problems are too big for one person to make a difference?" James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "All the time," he admitted. "But I remind myself that I'm not trying to fix the whole world. I'm just trying to make my little corner of it better. And sometimes that's enough." Emily nodded, his words resonating deeply. She thought about how often she had felt overwhelmed by the state of the world, unsure of how to channel her energy into something meaningful. James's perspective felt like a lifeline, simple yet profound. The cafe was nearly spotless by the time Emily finished cleaning. She poured herself a final cup of coffee and brought it over to James's table, sliding into the chair across from him. "So what's next for you?" she asked, cradling her mug in both hands. James shrugged lightly. "More of the same, I suppose. Running the cafe, having conversations, trying to build something that matters." Emily smiled. "I think you're already doing that." James's gaze softened. "So are you," he said, "more than you realize." For a moment they sat in companionable silence, the quiet hum of the cafe surrounding them. Emily felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in a long time. The day had been challenging, but it had also been transformative in ways she hadn't anticipated. Emily took a sip of her coffee, the warmth spreading through her chest. She glanced at James, who had leaned back in his chair, looking at ease despite the long day they had both shared. "You know," she began, hesitating slightly, "when I first saw that hat, I wasn't thinking about you as a person. I just saw everything I thought it represented." James smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "That's pretty common." "But it's not fair," Emily continued, her voice growing more earnest. "I mean, I've always prided myself on being open-minded, on treating people with respect, but today, I didn't do that. I let my assumptions get in the way." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's hard not to, especially when there's so much emotion tied to something like this, but recognizing it, that's the first step." Emily sighed, setting her mug down on the table. "I just feel like there's so much pressure to take a stand, to make it clear what side you're on, and sometimes that makes it hard to even hear the other side." James leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I get that," he said. "I've felt it too. But I've also learned that the more we dig into our corners, the harder it gets to find common ground. And common ground is where the real change happens." Emily tilted her head, considering his words. "Do you really think we can find common ground? I mean, things feel so divided right now." James gave her a small smile. "I do, but it takes work. It takes conversations like this, messy, uncomfortable conversations where we're willing to be honest and vulnerable. It's not easy, but it's worth it." As the night deepened, the quiet of the cafe became almost meditative. Emily found herself sharing more with James than she had expected, her frustrations, her hopes, her fears about the future. In turn, James spoke about his journey, his reasons for starting the Common Cup, and the challenges he faced in staying true to his vision. "I started this place because I wanted to create something different," he said, his voice steady. "A space where people didn't just coexist but connected, where they could talk to each other even when it was hard, especially when it was hard." Emily nodded, her admiration for him growing. "It feels like a big responsibility," she said, "carrying that kind of vision." James chuckled softly. "It is. But it's also a privilege. Not everyone gets the chance to build something meaningful. I try to remind myself of that when it gets overwhelming." Emily smiled, feeling a spark of inspiration. "I think you're making a bigger impact than you realize. Today felt different, like something shifted." James's gaze softened. "That means a lot to hear," he said. "But it's not just me. It's people like you, willing to have these conversations, willing to look beyond the surface. That's what really makes the difference." The clock ticked past closing time, but neither of them seemed eager to leave. The cafe felt like its own little world, separate from the chaos outside. Emily felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in a long time, as though the day's events had opened a door she hadn't even realized was there. "So, what's next for you?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. James shrugged lightly. "More of the same, I suppose. Running the cafe, having conversations, trying to bridge the gaps where I can." Emily nodded, her thoughts swirling. "I think I'd like to do more of that too," she said. "Not just here, but everywhere. I've spent so much time fighting for what I believe in, but maybe it's time I started listening too." James's smile widened. "That's a good place to start." The soft hum of the cafe's lights filled the silence between them. As Emily glanced around the now empty room, she rested her chin on her hand, staring into the dark liquid of her coffee. "You know," she said, breaking the quiet, "I've always thought of myself as someone who's on the right side of things, but today made me question whether being on the right side matters as much as I thought." James leaned forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on her. "What do you mean?" Emily hesitated, searching for the right words. "I mean, I spend so much time thinking about what I'm against, what I don't stand for. But I don't know if I've ever really thought about what I do stand for, what kind of world I want to build, not just what I want to tear down." James nodded thoughtfully, his expression encouraging. "That's an important realization," he said. "It's easy to define ourselves by what we oppose, but it's harder and more meaningful to think about what we're working toward." Emily traced the rim of her cup with her finger. "I guess I've been so caught up in the fight that I forgot there's more to it than that. I don't want to just be someone who opposes things. I want to be someone who creates something better." James's smile was small but genuine. "I think you're already on that path, and I think places like this cafe can help you get there." She looked up at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "How do you stay so hopeful, even when things feel so divided?" James leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant for a moment as he considered her question. "Because I've seen what happens when people lose hope," he said finally, "and I've seen what happens when they choose to hold on to it, even when it's hard. Hope is what keeps us moving forward. Without it, we just stay stuck." Emily nodded slowly, his words sinking in. She realized that she had been clinging to frustration and anger for so long that she hadn't left much room for hope. But sitting here, in the quiet glow of the cafe, she felt something shift, a small but powerful seed of possibility taking root. The clock ticked past 10, and the world outside the cafe had grown dark. Emily stretched her arms over her head, glancing at the stack of chairs she still needed to finish putting away. "I should probably wrap up," she said, standing and gathering their empty cups. James stood too, tucking his notebook under his arm. "Need a hand?" Emily shook her head with a smile. "You've already done enough for one day." James chuckled. "Fair enough. But before I go, I just want to say thank you for being willing to have this conversation. It means more than you know." Emily felt her cheeks flush slightly. "No, thank you," she said, "for being patient with me and for reminding me what this place is supposed to be about." James nodded, his expression warm. "I think you're going to make this place even better than it already is." James lingered by the door for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the cafe. "You've got something special here," he said softly. "And not just the coffee, the people, the atmosphere. It's rare." Emily smiled, setting the last of the chairs on the tables. "It feels different now," she admitted. "I think it's because of what happened today. It was uncomfortable, but it was important." James nodded, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "The best changes usually are." Emily leaned against the counter, watching him. "Do you ever think about what would happen if more places were like this? If people took the time to just talk?" James chuckled, shaking his head. "All the time. It's why I started this place. But it doesn't have to stop here. You don't need a cafe to start a conversation. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to listen." Emily thought about his words, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. "You've given me a lot to think about," she said. "Not just about this place, but about everything." "I'm glad," James said with a faint smile. He reached for his red cap, tucking it back on his head. The gesture was deliberate, but without arrogance, and for the first time, Emily didn't see it as a threat, just a piece of who he was. As he opened the door, the soft jingling of the bell echoed through the quiet cafe. "Take care, Emily," he said, his voice warm. "You too, James," she replied. "And thank you for everything." James nodded one last time before stepping into the cool night air. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Emily alone in the cafe. She glanced around the space, now quiet and still, and felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Today had been unexpected, uncomfortable, and eye-opening, but most of all, it had been meaningful. She turned off the lights, the cafe plunging into darkness save for the glow of the street lamp outside. As she locked the door and stepped into the night, she couldn't help but feel hopeful. Hopeful for the cafe, for the conversations yet to come, and for the bridges she hadn't realized she wanted to build. What do you think? Can conversations like the one Emily and James had truly bridged divides in our communities? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective.